China and China's foreign policy. Professor Gill is Professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies at Macquarie University in Sydney, and a Senior Associate Fellow with the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, in London. He had a 30-year career as a scholar, policy advisor, and author focusing on Asia-Pacific politics, foreign policy and security, with a particular focus on China and US-China relations. An academically trained and internationally respected China specialist, he has led a global top 10 think tank and held academic and research positions at world-leading universities and public policy research institutions in many countries, including the United States, some European countries, in Asia-Pacific region, in the 30-year international career. Dr. Gill received his PhD in foreign policy from Woodrow Wilson Department of Government and Foreign Affairs, University of Virginia. He has previously held positions at Australian National University and the University of Sydney. He was director of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and held the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He also served as a senior fellow in foreign policy studies and inaugural director of the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, where I actually met him and had the luck to work under him for a year. So actually we should have several other alumni from there. Dr. Trush, I've seen him already. At least is surely here. So among his international honors, he holds the Royal Order of Commander of the Polar Star, which I think is from Sweden, isn't it?
Yes.
And was named a top 10 American China expert by the Chinese Foreign Affairs University. So he has published several books, 8 books actually, and over 200 other publications, including most recently Rising Star, China's New Security Diplomacy, and China Matters, Getting It Right for Australia. His current research projects include a focus on the modernization of Chinese strategic forces, nuclear, cyberspace, and the fundamental drivers motivating China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping. So we are very happy to have you here. What I like very much is the topic of your talk, which is wolf warrior diplomacy. Is it working for China? I wrote about China's kind of assertive policy, but wolf warrior, I have never heard this this term, and I liked it very much. It even made me to find out what it means, and because I don't watch movies too much, especially American movies. But young people should know it better, I think. Well, so Bates, you are welcome, and the floor is yours.
Sasha, thank you very much to you and your colleagues, Alexandra, and everyone who's been so kind to invite me to join this evening. And thanks to everyone who's out there watching there in COVID land. I want to express to everyone my best wishes. And I hope everyone is doing well and that you and your family are safe and healthy and sane and getting through this very, very difficult time. It's especially nice to reconnect with you, Sasha. We've managed to stay in touch after all those years since we've been at the Brookings Institution together. Sometimes we've just simply bumped into each other completely unexpectedly in parts of China, which has always been a great pleasure and experience to do that. And so it's good to see you again this evening. It's funny you mentioned that you at least you suggested that the Wolf Warrior movie series is an American film. Of course, it's not.
Oh, sorry.
It is of course a series produced by in China, and the two greatest grossing films ever made in China, depicting the heroic exploits of Chinese special operations forces. I've seen the first one. I like those sorts of films. Very, very well done, really excellent and interesting. And of course, as a China watcher, all the more interesting to watch and try and interpret what it all means. But what I wanted to talk about today wasn't so much the film or even the Wolf Warrior diplomacy itself, but rather what it tells us about China's efforts to develop more in the way of an international narrative, more in the way of its expression to the outside world of how it's trying to be perceived and how it's trying to shape the world's perceptions about China. And what's really sparked me to pursue this effort is, of course, what's happened over the last 4 months. The COVID-19 crisis has both accelerated trends that are already well in motion, and we see them unfolding now even more rapidly. But they've also introduced, I think, some new tensions, some new developments that we're all trying to grapple with in terms of great power relations. And, you know, of course, the US-China rivalry is certainly not new, but here's a case where the COVID-19 crisis has added a new intensity to the relationship. And it was the Global Times, actually, who dubbed this term, who came up with this term of Wolf Warrior diplomacy, using the name of the film to apply then to what I think even the Global Times would gladly recognize to be a more assertive form of diplomacy. For us scholars, we would probably put it in the larger realm of what our Chinese would call the Huayuquan, the Huayuquan, some people call it discourse power or discursive power. I myself, I like the word narrative power. That I think fits a little bit more into what we're talking about. And so I'm really drawn to this, and I wanted to talk about it tonight. And what's interesting is that many people out there are arguing, not least in China, but lots of other parts of the world, that because of China's success, if that's the right word, or the relative success of China in dealing with the disease at home, and also being so proactive internationally, that somehow they have established a newfound soft power, a new kind of soft power to win the narrative battle, to win the battle for Huayuquan internationally, and of course, most particularly against the United States. And the question I have in my mind, is that really true? Is it the case that China is winning, or do we need to dig a little bit more deeply into what we mean by Huayuquan and what we mean by soft power, at least as most international academics define it. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight. I'll say that this is all going to be much more detailed, much more explained in a forthcoming article, which I have coming in the Washington Quarterly, hopefully in a few weeks' time. So let's just ask the question first, what do we mean by soft power? And just to remind ourselves, this was a term coined by Joseph Nye, almost 30 years ago. after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. And basically, in his definition, what we're talking about is the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, but to do it through things like attraction and shared values and a sense in the receiver of legitimacy, that what you're asking them to do is something they want to do in order to emulate or to follow or to share the same values that you have. This is very different, of course, from hard power, which Nye says is basically influence or getting others to do what you want them to do through inducement or payments or threats or coercion. And so that's the basic difference between hard and soft power as Nye defined it. And so my point in this article and my point this evening is to try and make the case that the way that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China approach propaganda and how they approach their effort to project influence, some people call that soft power, but it's not. It isn't. It is not soft power. In fact, not only is it not soft power, but it's fundamentally flawed internally. And in that way, we should not be calling it soft power at all. So that's sort of what I want to conclude with. But let me open this lens a bit more and really think about how to place the current COVID diplomacy. Some people call it, wolf warrior diplomacy. How to place that into the larger picture of what's going on. So we all know that the People's Republic of China, especially the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has really stepped up its effort in the last 4 months to try and take control of the narrative, the COVID-19 narrative. Primarily, of course, to put the party in its best possible light, but also to maybe portray China in a more positive way. And we see all sorts of things. This is a great picture of a check for $100,000 being passed over to Vanuatu by the ambassador there. Here is the famous Zhao Lijian, the deputy foreign minister and one of the foreign minister spokespersons, very active. We'll talk about him later. Here is a tweet by Hua Chunying about Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, telling him to stop lying through his teeth. So this is very assertive, something we're not accustomed to, and we've seen it most recently coming really to the fore in just the last 4 months. But my point is that this current effort that we're seeing right now in relation to COVID-19 is really just a small part, very high profile at the moment, but a small part of a much, much larger undertaking, which was launched, some people could date it back 20 or 25 years ago, which has seen a much more significant acceleration, a much more significant resourcing under Xi Jinping in the last 20 years. So what we're seeing, in other words, with the COVID-19 narrative really is just a small part of something much larger. I've said, and I'll say in the article, that the machine was ready to go and has already been active. But the COVID moment, has been a golden opportunity to really turn it into overdrive, the machine. And that's what we're seeing. So let's take a look at that larger context. Within months of Xi Jinping taking power in 2012, about 6 or 7 months later, at the National Conference on Ideology and Propaganda Work in August 2013, Xi Jinping sent a very, very clear signal about prioritizing what the Chinese would call external propaganda work. And it was here that he said this very famous phrase, "Tell China's story well." And here he's speaking to the most important people in China who deal with external propaganda. Tell China's story well. Spread China's voice. Strengthen our Huayuquan, our narrative power. Strengthen it internationally. The fact that he would keynote this national conference was critical. He sent a very powerful signal in 2013. He did it again in 2018. Just how important external propaganda work needed to be. Following his signaling, we saw a number of events that saw to the increase of the resources and the mandate available to the agencies in China who are responsible for external propaganda work. Among the most important developments was the creation of Voice of China. Voice of China, this huge media empire or conglomerate in China, which pulled together underneath the Chinese Communist Party Central Propaganda Department, pulled it under that auspices, Central Chinese Television, its international division, the CGTN, the China Global Television Network, you'll all be familiar with that, China National Radio, China Radio International, all pulled underneath the Central Propaganda Department. And that, in addition to the Xinhua news agency, has then given the Central Propaganda Department a very formal oversight over this enormous international presence which is being built out by all of these media organizations. That took place in 2018 and is only growing more. Also, very interestingly, diplomats we've seen most prominently, but also a number of party and state agencies, including, of course, state-owned media, have significantly increased their use of social media accounts like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, which of course are all banned inside China, but which have been increasingly utilized by diplomats and state-owned media and other PRC and CCP organizations to reach a much, much larger audience abroad. Part of my research for this article, I delved into a very interesting set of data, which has been drawn together by the German Marshall Fund Securing Democracy Project. If you've seen this work there, they follow the social media activity of both Chinese and Russian diplomats, state-owned media agencies, government bureaucracies, and so forth. And they show a very interesting trend in terms of Twitter, which I thought was quite interesting. Back between 2013 and 2018, their data show that each year, there were only 2 to 10 new accounts opened by such organizations from the People's Republic of China or from the CCP, the party. In 2019, there were 62 new accounts. So, a quadrupling of new accounts or more per year. And in 2020, if the current trend continues, we only have data through the end of April. But if current trends continue, there will be 100 new accounts opened on Twitter by these sorts of organizations. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of a trend line, it's quite remarkable. it's clear that Twitter is being taken on board by official organizations, official individuals, and state-owned media enterprises as a platform to put forward China's views, telling China's story well. One of the most famous users of Twitter, of course, is the current deputy foreign minister and one of the spokespersons of the Chinese foreign ministry, Zhao Lijian, who was quite active on Twitter some years ago, controversially indeed. But of course, since the outbreak of COVID-19 and his very active work on Twitter has really built out a large Twitter following. My last look at his Twitter feed about 3 days ago, he has something like 610 or 620,000 followers, almost triple his followership just from March. So it's quite remarkable presence that's being expanded by Chinese officialdom on these social media platforms. Also interestingly, ProPublica, which is a US-based think tank and research organization, as well as others, have identified the use of a lot of fake Twitter accounts. These are accounts that can actually be sourced to Chinese official organizations, which have fake names on them, but are being used, for likes and for retweets and so forth, to further expand the reach of the Twitter accounts of formerly official Chinese activity. In addition to all of this, of course, you look at organizations like the Global Times or the China Daily or Xinhua, CGTN, et cetera, tens of millions of followers there, and hundreds of millions of followers and active users of platforms like Sina Weibo or WeChat, which of course are monitored and censored by Chinese authorities, which are a popular source for information and news for people both inside China and outside of China. And of course, beyond those sorts of media platforms, which is where we're talking mostly today, we all are very familiar with lots of other organizations associated with the Chinese Communist Party that are well-resourced and very active internationally in terms of international propaganda work. Organizations like the United Front Work Department, the International Liaison Department, the China Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, the entire PRC diplomatic corps, and that's just a few. So my point is that this is a very well-resourced, increasingly empowered set of organizations and platforms that were already very active, especially beginning in 2019 in the Hong Kong protests, so that when COVID hit, this operation was really ready to go. And it did. And it was well primed and prepared to defend the party, right? And its leadership in the best possible way it could. So in early to mid-January, this apparatus at first was downplaying the severity of the outbreak and of course criticizing whistleblowers like Ai Wen and Li Wenjiang. This shifted slightly in early February as Xi Jinping finally took ownership, publicly took ownership of the fight, declares people's war, and of course, once he took ownership of it, the apparatus changes its approach to of course, praise the leadership's response and highlight foreign endorsement. By March, with the epidemic beginning to subside a bit in China, but also beginning to spread globally, the message changes to deflect blame away from China and to publicize China's efforts to assist in the fight against COVID-19 around the world. And of course, we all know that by mid to late March and continuing even today, the narrative changed yet again to become definitely more harsh against foreign criticism of China's COVID response, but also especially critical of the United States, its response to COVID-19 domestically and internationally, and pushing back quite forcefully against American criticism. So that's sort of where we are today in terms of the history of how it's built up to where it was and how the COVID-19 crisis really brought it to the fore. So the question I'm trying to ask myself is this working? How well is it working? Does the Chinese leadership believe it's working? And how is the world reacting? Well, again, let's step back. Let's recall Joseph Nye's definition of soft power. By that definition, China was already doing quite poorly before COVID-19, before all the disaster and catastrophe of the pandemic began. Looking at the polling numbers, since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, China's international polling numbers on average have been in decline since 2012, both in terms of the overall favorability ratings of China, as well as towards Xi Jinping himself, in terms of that famous question that all these polls ask, do you count on the leader of China to do the right thing in world affairs? Well, in both favorability and in terms of that confidence ranking, the numbers have been going down, or at least not going up, that's for sure. Another interesting report, the Soft Power 30 report, which ranks 30 countries across something like 70 different indicators. It has also put China at the very bottom of its soft power rankings since it began its survey back in 2016. China was 27 out of 30 in 2019. And here's an interesting quote from a recent Pew Research Center poll. It said that majorities in most countries agree that China's influence has grown, but that is not translated into favorable views of the country. I mean, I think that pretty much defines what Nye's talking about. The difference between hard power, which is influence, yes. Soft power, no, in terms of the favorability that the Pew organization has found in its international polling. Moreover, the way that China has responded to the COVID-19 crisis has obviously only exacerbated pre-existing concerns that many already had about China and its sort of its appeal, whether its likability, its favorability. I'm quite sure, I would make a random guess here, that when these international polling organizations issue new surveys, I suspect that China will come out of it post-COVID, not very well, on average, on an international average. We know that China did not handle the early outbreak of COVID very well and has been criticized internationally for its lack of transparency early in the outbreak. We know that China has been criticized, not just by the United States, but elsewhere, for trying to deflect its responsibility for that handling of the crisis early on, and also for some of its official spokespersons trying to sow doubt, trying to introduce doubt into what the original source of the virus might have been. There's still debate in some ways, but there can be no doubt that the principal source of the spread internationally of the virus arose out of Wuhan in China. In the EU, for example, the principal foreign affairs official for the EU has even raised questions about China's generosity, suggesting that it's a part of China's struggle for influence through what he called the politics of generosity. So the COVID crisis, unfortunately, has not helped China overall improve its international image. And as I say, it's only exacerbating pre-existing challenges that China had with its image internationally. Countries around the world were already beginning, before COVID, to rethink their dependency upon China and their concerns about supply chains. Well, COVID-19 has only deepened and accelerated that kind of thinking. There was already underway debates in countries, not just the United States, but many countries, about the idea of partial disengagement. The United States has spoken about decoupling, which of course is overblown. But my point is that those discussions were already underway. Now that we are at this point in the COVID-19 crisis, these debates are even more serious and are being taken even more deeply. And of course, the international community, much of the international community, has had a lot of problems with China's system of governance, with its human rights record, with its quashing of freedom of speech and the internet and whatnot. That's a given. Well, many aspects of its response to the COVID-19 crisis has only reinforced, or at least provided more fodder for those voices in countries around the world to continue to criticize China's approach. So I think that at this point at least, and we've got lots of time to go through this, but at this point at least, in spite of its best efforts to shape the COVID-19 narrative in its favor, the party still has a major international image problem that isn't going to go away very quickly. It's going to be difficult for it to resolve in the medium to near term. And interestingly, in just the last day or two, there is news that internal PRC assessments seem to think the same thing. Many of you would have seen the report coming out of Reuters that the Ministry of State Security think tank that we all know, CICIR, C-I-C-I-R, issued a report that has apparently been leaked to Reuters, which has warned Beijing, the report has warned Beijing that they should prepare for a backlash against China that is going to be similar, in their view, to the international response to the Tiananmen crackdown in June of 1989. This is new reporting. I think there's going to be some more scrutiny of this, but it doesn't surprise me. I think the internal assessment by Kicker is correct. So, if China's been trying for 20 years, and especially under Xi Jinping, has so intensively tried to increase the mandate and the resources available to telling China's story well, to trying to create greater soft power for China, what happened? What's gone wrong? Why has it had such trouble in trying to promote itself in a more favorable way? My assessment is that there are at least three inbuilt structural problems with how the party approaches propaganda generally, and its attempts at soft power more specifically. So first, the first problem is the principal purpose of these propaganda efforts. All of the resources that have been mobilized to tell China's story well have at their heart the goal of praising, defending, and legitimizing the party. And that's not my assessment. Those are the very words of Xi Jinping himself. That fact will automatically mean that it's going to be fundamentally unappealing to anyone who objects to authoritarian political systems. But even if you can put that aside, put that objection aside, it's also true that information that comes from these sorts of systems that are truly devoted to simply defending and praising and legitimizing a one-party state, we all know are not subject to scrutiny or criticism. They're not objective. So that further undermines the credibility of that kind of information campaign. So in other words, it's propaganda, propaganda in its most negative sense. So that's problem number one about how China's trying to deal with its efforts that they call soft power. Second, the principal audience. Who is the principal audience of China's propaganda efforts? In my view, rather than really seeking to appeal to foreign audiences through soft power, PRC and CCP efforts to cast the party and China in a more favorable light, these are predominantly meant for domestic audiences in China. And most importantly, it's really meant for the party itself. In other words, these are party messages for the party itself. That's predominantly the case. Of course, yes, in some cases, foreign audiences are intended to be affected and their perceptions shaped. But the number one audience is the party itself. The CCP is an increasingly self-possessed, self-regarding organization that's very concerned with its image, with its legitimacy, and with its ability to rule. This is a kind of soft power. I mean, think of corporations or other organizations who use soft power to appeal to their own employees, right? Or they stand up their leader, their CEO, as a way of attracting support from their stakeholders or from their employees. That's a kind of soft power. But in Joe Nye's definition of global soft power or international soft power, it doesn't work because the number one audience is the internal organization, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party, which is simply not going to be that appealing to foreigners. Not usually, not normally. At the least, we can say it's a flaw in the approach to appealing to foreigners, which the Chinese Communist Party has to accept and deal with. This is why so much of the wolf warrior diplomacy is not for foreign audiences. I mean, why would it be? Some of it's very insulting. Some of it's quite offensive. Clearly, it's not meant for foreign audiences. It's meant for home audiences. It's meant for the Chinese Communist Party. It's probably even meant for the career trajectory and promotion possibilities of the individuals themselves. So that's a second problem. The audience is not really an audience that generates soft power internationally. And then lastly, the actual function of a lot of Chinese propaganda and international influence activity really isn't soft power. Let's go back to Nye's definition. By Nye's definition of soft and hard power, China gains influence, that is for sure. It gains influence, but it gains influence through hard power, not soft power. By Nye's definition, Beijing builds influence abroad through economic carrots and sticks, what he would call inducements or payments or coercion. And that builds then expectations and political leverage within foreign countries that are targeted, but that's influence. That's hard power influence. That's not soft power. And I think you can say that about a lot of things that some people call soft power that China's got, but it isn't. It's hard power. It's hard-nosed influence projection on the part of China by leveraging its economic advantages, strengths, inducements, payments, etc. The CCP is far more adept at seeking influence and respect through hard power. And here's a saying I think you could use. It's good at exercising hard power softly, but has a hard time exercising soft power. Now, I don't know, but I would think that this is actually, in many ways, preferable to the CCP leadership. They say they want soft power. They even claim to have it. But I think they must understand that, in fact, it's hard power where they have advantage. It works for them. It's easier for them to exercise. And of course, it is exactly primarily economic leverage where they have the greatest strengths. So with all this in mind and looking ahead, what can we expect then in the way of wolf warrior diplomacy or soft power? I don't like that term in terms of what we're talking about, but in terms of Chinese influence projection and propaganda going forward. What does the whole COVID-19 episode tell us? Well, first, discounting Chinese soft power doesn't mean it doesn't have some. It does. More importantly, it certainly doesn't mean that China does not have geopolitical influence. It does. My point is that we shouldn't confuse the two. China definitely has geopolitical influence. China definitely has hard power influence. It does not have much in the way of soft power. And we should not confuse or conflate the two. This may have some resonance for some parts of the world that want to exercise soft power. Because I think they shouldn't be dismayed at all by these ideas that China can somehow move into the soft power space. It can't. And I'm not even sure, quite honestly, that the CCP leadership wants to truly operate in the soft power arena. Secondly, looking ahead, we may be seeing some kind of a pause right now in wolf warrior diplomacy. We might be seeing a step back, a slight step back, now that there's such pushback coming from the international community. I was intrigued, for example, some of you may have read Fu Ying's op-ed, which appeared in the People's Daily in Chinese in early April, and was recently translated into English It was translated differently, slightly differently, in the China Daily about 3 weeks later. Some people are interpreting that op-ed as a kind of subtle signal from her that the harsh rhetoric, the harsh diplomacy has to be pulled back a little bit. More interesting, of course, was Zi Zhongyun's, the former director of the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, her very interesting essay about China's wolf warrior diplomacy, quite critical, likening it to the boxers of the Boxer Rebellion 120 years ago, and her call for a more civilized discourse coming out of China. Who knows? But it could signal some pullback on this campaign coming out of China over the past 4 months. Maybe. But even if that's true, that's not the end of it. That's certainly not the end of it. I think that the party probably views the recent campaign with COVID-19 or against the international community on COVID-19 as being primarily a success. It's certainly been a success at home. My understanding is that the Chinese people themselves are probably pretty happy with the outcome for them in terms of the government's response to COVID-19. All the more happy when they see or hear about what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think for the party itself, it's created a kind of rally round the leader, rally round the party mentality, which again, that's its purpose. And so that in itself is a success. So if it is a pause for the moment, it won't be for long. I think the lessons being taken from this episode is adapt, become more agile, push harder into other technologies and platforms and methods of telling China's story well, and come back another day even more effectively, more aggressively, more forcefully in pushing that story. So one concluding remark, it's possible that in the future, we might see a more authentic or appealing, or I would say internationally effective form of Chinese soft power coming out in the future. For the time being, though, we need to call it influence projection, or call it what it is. It's propaganda. It's not soft power, but it could change. I think it's unlikely that that would happen as long as the party is in charge, simply because to really adopt a soft power posture would be too risky, would allow too many unknowns and too much lack of control, quite honestly, on the part of the party to allow that to happen. There's an old adage, an old saying about soft power that I really like. And that saying is, the best propaganda is no propaganda at all. But I think we can all agree that that's an adage or a principle or an approach that the party is simply not going to adopt. So thanks very much. I really look forward to your feedbacks and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Bates. In our China seminar, we usually have two official or appointed commentators. So now I wanted to give the floor first to Sergei Trush, whom you know.
Hello, Sergei.
Have you switched on his microphone?
Do you hear me?
Hello, Sergei.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I
yes.
can.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, Bates. Hi.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon, all the colleagues. Bates is a good friend and a colleague and a robust professional. And it was a big pleasure to work together in Brookings almost 20 years ago. And probably not all the audience know that his talents are much more broader than the political analyst, and he's not the only he's not only top 10 analyst in China security and military issues, but he's a good musician. I remember 20 years ago when we
I remember that.
I remember that. Yeah, I think it was your 40th birthday or something, and you were playing in a band. I'm not figuring out whether it was a jazz band or a rock band, but it was a very remembering. And
it was in Frederick, Maryland, Sergei.
Right, it was Maryland. And this artistic personality, as you are, is reflected on the angle of thinking of the China policy matters. So when I saw this a little belletristic topic of your talk today, warrior diplomacy, and when I connected with your personality, it was not looking so much exotic for me. But talking to the points of discussion, I was asked to make some points, discussing points as a discussant, but I'm not very much focused on the specific topic Bates was talking today, but whatever we call the Chinese diplomacy, either the wolf barrier, or the assertive diplomacy, proactive diplomacy, but the critical sphere of its implementation and effectiveness probably is its relations with US and Russia, and how it is perceived, reflected and reacted on in United States and Russia. So I would concentrate my little comments mainly from this angle. And I would start saying that the fact of the matter is that both United States and Russia at this very period are experiencing serious internal pressures, big evolutionary changes and domestic insecurities, which are influencing their response to China diplomacy. Speaking of the US, the Trump administration shows that, well, the United States as a political, as a polity, as a society, as a political system is demonstrating a situation of deep internal split in basic beliefs and political values of this country. Such values regarding the basic issues like the role of the state in economy, the social obligations of the state, the taxation principles, the access to education, immigration policy was rather stable for the several previous decades in American political system. And it was like the centrist core of beliefs that were uniting the American society and the American electorate, no matter pro-democratic or pro-republican, but it was the core consensus inside United States society which make the United States as a power, as a state keeping afloat. But now this consensus is gone. It's vanished, and the reasons for that are manifold. So we know that part of it is the shifts in demographic, shift from the post-war of generation of the baby boomers to the generation X, or even more to the millennials, or the generation of Facebook. So who are coming to the political prominence inside the country. The second factor is, of course, the ethnical shifts that the United States were experiencing in the recent several decades, with the end of political domination of the white Anglo-Saxon population and the lead coming to the Afro-American, Hispanic and Asian groups, especially of the millennials. At the economic field, we see the obvious contradictions and profit disparities on the corporate level between big financial and high-tech corporations oriented on the global value chains on the one hand, and on the other hand, between the less globalized middle and the small businesses, companies in traditional industries like steel making, chemical, electric machinery, and so on. So the lack of this core political consensus in the United States drives it to the situation when the traditionally strong points of American polity and the democracy, the division of branches of power, became the reason for institutional stalemate. So what we are witnessing in the last 4 years of Trump presidency is the total witch hunt between the Congress and administration. Well, turning to Russia, Putin government is obviously also facing the strong internal pressure of unsatisfied and fragmented society. After 30 years of post-communist development, post-communist rule, 20 of which were under Putin, we have the striking income disparities in society, state-run capitalism with monopoly of a handful big companies, mostly related to the energy sector, almost zero motivations for technological progress, degradation of fundamental science, degradation of pension system, absence of socially oriented, absence of socially oriented economy, oriented on the modern civilized conditions of.
The talk was on China, I remember. Could
Uh,
you
well,
come?
I'm talking about why China is perceived here. I will be more developing on this talking. So, and this coronavirus crisis in Moscow and its growing deadly toll, together with the seriousness and mortality of the epidemic itself, is showing how badly we are prepared for this social stress like this. And after years of so-called optimization of medical sphere, so on. So turning to the issue how China proactive and wolf warrior diplomacy is being received in the US and Russia, my sense is that that in both capitals, it is this response to China is seriously ideologic and internally driven. Well, in the US case, Trump is obviously using the COVID intrigue, this scandal over the COVID epidemic, whatever the truth is, to capitalize on it during the election campaign. And Trump, main trump cards for this election campaign was, of course, economy, stock exchange, job increases, tax reform, phase one of the China deal as a part of it, as a part of his success story. But this trump cards could be seriously damaged, if not beaten, in the outcome of the coronavirus wave. So Trump uses this issue, whatever the real story is, to substitute his economy victories. So this looks like traditional Trump-style political poker game. Russia's response to China is also seriously internally driven. President Putin's main instrument to block internal pressures is his foreign policy. His ideology of standing up from the knees with Crimea, Ukraine, Syria being a part of it is also very hardly a big success story. But it is impossible without China, its role and as an alternative world pole, its growing military capabilities, its economy, its credits, plus Russian-Chinese geopolitical neighborhood and common border. So I'm afraid that I'm using too much time as a discussant, so I'll probably stop at this point, and that's giving enough time for Q&A and for discussion with the main speaker. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think the main idea was that it's not only China's fault, but the fault of everybody that we don't understand the message.
The main idea was that we are having the Eurasian seminar with many countries playing in a concert. That's why we are having to focus in the internal situations in any country.
Yes, so could I give the floor to Vasily Kashin? Vasily, are you here? And then maybe Bates is going to react to both.
So I've turned the microphone on. It should work.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Bates, for this excellent presentation. I wanted to elaborate on one of your points, that part of that propaganda effort is aimed actually on the on the inside Chinese population. The Chinese Communist Party has a very long history of placing news items abroad, primarily, of course, in Hong Kong media, but also quite often outside of the Greater China area, and then bringing this news into the internal Chinese market. And this is one of the oldest propaganda mechanisms they use, especially during the reforms and openness period. A lot of such leaks, especially concerning Chinese security policies, areas where they don't want to say anything official, but want to keep their population informed, happened even in earlier periods when China was conducting passive foreign policy. It happened in 1980s and 1990s, but of course it surged tremendously recently. Basically, for many people who watch the developments in the Chinese military, it's already a quite recognizable pattern that you see some information first emerging in the Chinese social media, then being a kind of confirmed or placed into some second-rate media outlet abroad, and that brought to mainstream Chinese media with reference to this outlet. And in this situation, we see that, of course, these Chinese media outlets, who are supposed to be basically players on for external audience, are being widely cited inside of China. So the key question here is to what extent actually this propaganda effort is aimed at external audience, and to what extent it's aimed on internal audience. To my understanding, some of the actions, some of the statements which are conducted by the Chinese diplomats, for example, are so openly destructive from the diplomatic point of view. And sometimes you can see that these words are being said by the people you knew before, and you knew they never were like that, and they actually never supported this way of doing things. And I think many people in the Chinese foreign policy apparatus quite understand the consequences they are facing. And you see the news, the Chinese ambassadors are being called and giving protests in various countries, from Kazakhstan to France. But they are still doing this because they have to, because at this point, the most important thing for them is how this news will be received inside of China. Maybe it's a kind of survival mode functioning for the, or crisis mode functioning for the Chinese state apparatus, because so much effort should be dedicated to improving the country leadership image in the eyes of the Chinese population. And in this case, it's absolutely successful, because the Chinese population have wanted to see their country more assertive on the international arena. They've been waiting, they've been criticizing the leadership for not standing up to the West, and now this is happening. And this is, of course, keeping them happy. So to my understanding, the big issue is like to which percentage all of this behavior, both by Chinese diplomats and by Chinese external propaganda system, is driven by the internal situation and aimed at the internal audience, and to which extent is aimed at the external audience. To a certain extent, to my understanding, they're also facing a kind of problem of growth. They simply don't have enough people in their foreign propaganda apparatus who understand the basics of doing such things. And we've seen a lot of funny episodes, including in Russia, for example, recently, what Chinese embassy has done here. they found a newspaper which is called Truth Labor. It's an old Soviet era newspaper. Most people even forgotten it exists. And they placed a huge article which consisted of excerpts from Xi Jinping's speeches on fighting COVID-19. And that was like looking absolutely unnatural and funny, and people were like laughing at them at some point. So at some points they don't even understand what is happening. If they are moving, if they are going to become more subtle, what, to your opinion, what is the role of the PLA propaganda apparatus and taking into account all of these three warfares concept? Because, well, we know that PLA has its own rather strong external covert propaganda service, which is currently called Liaison Bureau of the Political Department of the Central Military Commission, and this is like one of the oldest parts of the Chinese intelligence community, which was reorganized in the past. There were good articles on that service, I think, by Project 2049 Institute and by Mark Stokes and others. Not so much is known about the service after the great reorganization of the PLA, which happened in like 2016, 2015, 2016. But we know that some of the former leaders were put into prison, but it's supposed to exist. And it used to be, they were the guys who were supposed to be clever and to do clever things, and they were just kind of sophisticated compared to the general external propaganda apparatus. And is anything known about their activity? Because I think it's like, it should be exciting. In general, of course, there is an understanding that the Chinese have built a huge machine, and they've written a lot of theories how they would expand their soft power, but the actual results are like absolutely miserable. It's a machine which works inside of China, doesn't work outside of China at all. And it's interesting to compare it with the period when Chinese Communist Party and People's Republic of China really had soft power, and that was the period of Mao Zedong. It was like 1960s, 1970s, when you really had people all around Asia supporting those ideas, fighting for those ideas, and you even had people in some of the developed countries supporting those ideas. And that was done with extremely limited resources, with very few actual propaganda effort. Like they didn't have all these instruments they have now. And it's interesting to imagine how they see this difference between them at that time and them now themselves. I think it should bring them to some conclusions about the ideological situation in the country and how they, what their chances in the ideological competition are. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Let me just add a question to that. There's a Daniel Khataev who wants to ask, well, basically wants me to read his question, but the idea is basically that Chinese like active soft power diplomacy now, isn't it based on the fact that China is strong economically? And if it becomes weaker kind of after the pandemic, maybe they're going to slow down on that, on propaganda as well. But my question is also connected to this. Well, there was a time, and I remember, well, there's no question that China's soft power is not working, but there was a time when it did, actually. China was quite popular in the 1980s and 1990s even. I remember it was a great friend of Japan, and the Japanese people liked it during Hu Yaobang's time, for example, and later it was rather popular in Europe, even in the United States. So what happened basically? Is it, do people dislike it just because it's too strong? Or there is something, or they are doing something wrong? And maybe this can be changed then in that, in that case. Well, thanks. Bates, is your microphone on?
Yeah, I got it. Sergey, Vasily, and Sasha, thanks very much for those great comments. I've really tried to remember many of the important points you brought up. I mean, first of all, I think Sergey's overall point that in terms of great power relations, the reaction to China's assertion of, what do you want to call it, propaganda or soft power, whatever you want to call it, you know, is going to be felt differently in those two states. I think it's a great point, because it depends on, you know, what the internal political situation is within them. And I thought Sergey did a great job of assessing, you know, what those domestic political situations are. I purposely tried, both in this presentation and in the article with the Washington Quarterly, not to get into the larger question of great power relations. For one reason, lots of people have been doing it and have tried to frame the whole COVID issue in terms of US-China relations. Very important, but I was simply trying to dive more deeply into what I interpret as the internal Chinese motivation. But very, very good points, and I'm going to keep that on board. Vasily also asked, you know, what's the weight between importance of external versus importance of internal messaging? And, you know, there's no way of knowing. There really isn't. But I'm strongly convinced that the importance of internal messaging is so much greater. Why? And this gets to another one of your questions. And maybe it gets into Sasha's question as well. I think it's because the party is uncertain, is unsure of itself. It's having its own internal struggles about what to do in terms of its own legitimacy and its own path forward. I think that they must be struggling very hard with, you know, how to move ahead as a one-party organization into a more modern and dynamic and internationally appreciated and respected nation. This has been China's struggle for 150 years, and so the internal messaging, I think, remains very, very important, if for no other reason than simply to hold on to power. Maybe it can morph into something more grandiose, something more, nationally rejuvenating, which is what they claim. I'm not sure that's yet going to be the case, but I think they're worried about it. And so a lot of the messaging is directed at home. And even more importantly, it's not just the Chinese citizenry. I think it's the party itself. I don't think the party cares that much about the citizenry, not really. I mean, the constituency, the most important body politic of the People's Republic of China is obviously the party itself, which is huge, 90 million people, not to mention the Youth League. I mean, we're talking about 150 million, a tenth of the population. So it's enormously important that organized, those people, the elite, the people that run everything, have to be confident, have to be self-assured, have to know that what they're doing is the right thing. You mentioned the PLA. I don't know. I mean, two comments on that. Obviously, the PLA and its propaganda element is among the most conservative, pro-party elements of the entire apparatus. And so I don't see how they are going to try and adopt any sort of different or more reform-oriented approach to projecting China's image abroad. I think they're just going to follow whatever the party says, and all the more so since 2015, 2016, when Xi Jinping made very sure to reassert and clamp down even harder on the PLA and how it operates, including a reinvigoration of the ideological component within the PLA. So one interesting part of the PLA that's going to be very important going forward in terms of propaganda and image projection is, as you know, is the strategic support force. So the newly created strategic support force has, as an explicit part of its mission, political warfare. And so, as we look at the PLA and try to understand what role it's going to play in as part of this larger game, this larger information warfare game, it's the strategic support force that's going to be the most interesting part to watch, I think. Through its cyber activity, through its political warfare activity, three PLA, all those organizations are all under the strategic support force now. Sasha, you said, why now? It's a great question. Why is that's called the West reacting? I think you put your finger on one thing. Yes, it's because China's getting stronger. But it's another thing, obviously. It's getting stronger and it's more determined to be authoritarian. So it's not just that it's stronger and more ideologically problematic, right, for the West. And not only is it more ideologically problematic because it's stronger, but it appears as if the internal mechanisms of the PRC are determined to push even harder on that, let's call it ideological side of its character. And not only to try and do it for its own internal purposes, but to an increasing degree, try and make the case abroad that that part of its character, its authoritarian Leninist character, should be accepted and deemed legitimate by the outside world. That's become a much more important element, I would say, under Xi Jinping of its outward looking efforts, right? And so it's not just that they're stronger, Sasha, it's that they're pushing harder on this very sensitive aspect of its character, sensitive in the way that the West looks at it, which is also problematic. And in combination, it's generating pushback. It's generating skepticism. It's generating unhappiness, and everything that we're seeing now. And like I said in my presentation, I think the COVID episode, just these 4 months, have just added fuel to that flame, put so much more, it's emphasized all those issues in so many ways now that we see what's happened, and it's creating this chasm of difference between China and certainly the liberal democratic world, if that's the right way of putting it, that we wouldn't have expected 4 months ago, and now it's even bigger.
Well, thank you. We have actually, I know that it's late, so you are free to finish when you wish. Yeah, go ahead.
One of your colleagues raised a very, very interesting question. I'm sorry I didn't respond to it at first. And that was the point that if so much of Chinese influence has been bought, basically, it's the classic Nye hard power definition of inducement or payment or even coercion through economic advantage. If because of COVID-19, that lever, that advantage is going to weaken, what does that mean for Chinese influence? It's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I think probably in the near term, lots of countries will think deeply about how to reduce their dependence on China. Will think about how to, as they put it, diversify or disengage. And that may happen to a degree, but if you look at the figures, at least as the IMF or the World Bank is presently predicting, in spite of this terrible year that we're going through economically in 2020, China's going to come out of it, in terms of growth at least, better than most. So 2021 growth predictions, something around 6 or 7% year on year growth. So in other words, in a year or two, we're going to come back to a similar situation where, the engine of international economic growth is still going to be China. Diminished, yes. Some will try to decouple or disengage or diversify. That's true. But I think China is still going to have a lot of advantages and levers to use in this influence game. So I guess I would say near to medium term, yes, that's not going to be a great advantage for China. It'll be interesting, though, to see in 2 or 3 years whether we might get back to something that looks a little bit more like it did, say, 6 or 12 months ago, which will give China those advantages once again.
Great. So you mean it's going to be hard for China, but for others it's going to be even harder? Probably.
Well, I think in soft power terms, no. In hard power influence terms, yes.
Okay. So Olga Krasniak, who is a professor at our university,
Thank you.
has a question. Go ahead, please.
I have a very quick question to Bates. I'm a researcher of diplomatic studies, and I'm particularly focusing on science diplomacy. So my question is about diplomacy. So how to conduct old-style corridor diplomacy, this high-stakes diplomacy in the age of digital media, in the age of the social media. And the second question is coming from the first one. So now this warrior diplomacy, China basically humiliates and threatens other countries like Australia. And just a few days ago, Australia was called, I just picked up it on Twitter, a gum stuck to China's shoe. So it's not so nice way to talk to other countries. So will warrior diplomacy backfire? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Olga, for that question. I think you're going to be the one who tells us ultimately whether diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, will survive the digital age. I had the same question. I find it such an enormous change and a wholly different way of conducting international relations. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but it's definitely different, and it's not going to stop. It won't stop. It will become more sophisticated. It will become more clever, and it won't be official diplomacy at all. It will be a kind of gray zone, right? Where things can be said, threats can be issued, coercion can be leveled, but governments can claim to have no official connection, or can play the game the way they like. So I guess in terms of diplomacy, the ability for diplomats and analysts to discern and fully understand the authoritativeness and meaning of these messages is going to get much, much harder. On the upside, I suppose it gives governments more options, more ways, more tools to try to achieve their interests, to signal their interests. But it's also higher risk, right? Because the more signals one reads, the more chance there is for misinterpretation, misunderstanding, or escalation, in a direction that becomes uncontrollable. So what we're entering, I think, a much more high risk and less clear moment. That was already true, I think, but now that great powers, the United States, Russia, China, are all engaging in this business now, and overtly, covertly, it creates an enormous amount of confusion, and I think ultimately mistrust, which is not good for diplomatic relations at all. It's really quite risky. Does that mean that wolf warrior diplomacy is going to be pulled back? I don't think so. At the moment, if I'm right, that at least the most aggressive or assertive or offensive aspects of this, if I'm right that it's mostly targeting home audiences, and if I'm right that the party in China, at least, remains a uncertain and sort of unsure organization about itself, then this kind of messaging will continue. I mean, maybe one thing to do is, for diplomats, is to unpack this and maybe recognize some of this messaging for what it is. I mean, the gum on the bottom of the shoe, yes, it's insulting, but maybe it's not really reflective of what the real decision makers want. It's reflective of a mood, but maybe it's not reflective of what policymakers want to achieve ultimately. But again, unpacking that and really understanding the difference between what the Global Times says and what the foreign ministry says is very hard to do. in these times. It gets increasingly difficult. Ultimately, for diplomacy to work, there has to be trust. And I think in these times, trust can only be established between authoritative people, voices, human beings that actually have a channel, a trusted and reliable channel to one another in order to try and move their governments towards, solutions and answers to their problems. But very hard to do. And all the more so now that 1,000 voices, unattributable, unaccountable, can condemn you and criticize you and destroy you politically. We're moving into very difficult diplomatic days.
Thank you. Grigory Kucherenko has an interesting question, actually, because you've talked about influence in like general West, but he's going to ask about smaller countries. Grigory, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead with your question.
Mr. Gill, first, allow me to thank you for coming to this conference.
Thank you.
Very interesting and informative. I would like to ask your opinion on Chinese influence in low middle-income countries, specifically in Cambodia. Can you say that this economic hard power model is effective for those countries? Since Chinese build infrastructure, provide investment, military equipment, and etc. Also, I'd like to ask, maybe this policy might become even more effective due to COVID-19 pandemic, since poor countries might become even poorer as a result. Thank you.
Thank you, Grigory. I think the short answer to you is yes and yes. My point is that we don't call it soft power. It's hard power. It is the leveraging of economic inducement and advantage to create influence. And so, yes, certainly in a country like Cambodia, and we could name dozens more, it works in terms of influence. In other words, it's bribery. It's a kind of bribery. Or you're buying influence in Joe Nye's thinking because you're able to influence political leaders and societies toward your preferences because you're providing benefits of various kinds, and you named them, assistance, infrastructure, trade, and so forth. So yes, I think that China has a lot of advantages, particularly among, as you said, developing countries, precisely because of that economic power, economic hard power. And yes, I think in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, or as we go through this, at the moment, it appears as if China will retain many of those advantages. Even as their economy shrinks, it's not going to shrink as badly as others. And at least by current predictions, will come out of the downturn in 2021 more strongly than many other major economies around the world. So that means that it will retain a lot of those advantages that you just described. And yes, some countries are going to be very heavily hurt by this, especially those with poorer infrastructures and ability to respond. And China might be in a great position to help. And I'm sure they will try. So, another way of looking at this is that countries that may have already been influenced by or had already sort of agreed to be closer with China precisely because of the economic advantages they provide, they're going to be more inclined to do so as a result of this crisis. Whereas countries that had already begun to rethink their relationship with China, who had already begun to question their economic dependence, countries that might be in a position to diversify and disengage, they will do so all the more quickly now because of the COVID-19 crisis. So I like what Richard Haas had to say about a month or two ago about COVID-19. He said, we're going to see an acceleration of trends that were already happening. And I think it's true as well in terms of this economic set of relationships, issues of economic influence that you're bringing up, Grigori.
Oh, thanks. I think we should let you go at some point because it's almost midnight, isn't it?
Midnight, yeah.
So could you take two more questions?
I'm getting less and less coherent.
Well, two more questions and we'll let you go. Is it?
Sure, Sasha. Thank you. Of course.
So there is, the next one is from Richard Waits, who is from Washington. I think he's in, Richard, are you in Washington?
Yes, I am.
Yes. You've been to Washington base, so you can.
I know,
So,
Richard.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, as you know, people here are, some agree that Chinese messaging is self-defeating or happy to let it sink on its own accord, whereas others are thinking what counter messaging or countermeasures the U.S. can take. And one I've heard is being discussed in the administration is to ban countries like China from using social media that they don't let their own, the governments don't let their own people use. So I wasn't sure what Dr. Gill thought about that idea.
Well, that's an interesting idea, and I would say that there's an aspect of that that's already happened, of course, and that's with the Trump administration's decision to expel, or I should say limit the number of Chinese state-owned media operatives, journalists, whatever you want to call them, to work inside the United States. That it's kind of, there's a corollary there or a parallel. I guess my question would be, I mean, I hadn't actually heard this particular proposal, Richard, that you just brought up, but so I'm a little bit new to it. But on first blush, my first question would be, how do you actually do that in a country like the United States? I guess what you'd have to do is come up with a legal or regulatory directive to organizations like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter to deny demonstrably Chinese, demonstrably CCP, demonstrably PRC accounts from operating. You'd have to do that, which would immediately raise all kinds of issues in the United States, I would presume, about free speech or imposing government will on private companies and all that. But even if you could resolve that issue, then you'd have the whole problem of knowing which accounts to deny and which not to. I'm not a real technological wizard here, but I think I know that I could pose to be almost anybody I wanted to be in the Twitter sphere, even if I was Zhao Lijian. So that would make it hard too. So I see the sentiment behind it. In some ways, maybe my heart sort of likes it, but my mind tells me that it would be really hard to implement. And if I'm wrong on all of that, and if you've heard better ideas, as I say, I'm just thinking about it off the top of my head here. It'd be interesting to hear how that would actually get done.
Thanks. We have the last question from Mr. I think Wahab. Can you switch on the microphone?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So, Dr. Bates, I would like to ask, now during the speech you have introduced that the current soft power of China is not working very well. So I would like to ask what kind of successful, in ideal situation, what kind of successful soft power do you think China is able to build up, and how that soft power would be attractive to the international audiences?
Wow, thank you very much. That's I think a great question to close on. I mean, I think a lot of us who are on this call have a lot of admiration for some things in China, right? I mean, there's no doubt that it's a country that's had a remarkable history. There's lots of things about China that are attractive. Its people are fantastic. The language is remarkable, diverse, nuanced, beautiful. Cuisine, the culture, the inventiveness, all of those things are appealing. And I can say that, you know, as a younger person, I was definitely attracted to all of those things. So, you know, you can see elements of China, you know, in the big picture China that are appealing and interesting, and maybe even worthy of emulation and followership. But you know, that's not what China is today, and you could even argue it hasn't been for a long time. Many of those elements actually were crushed, nearly destroyed during certain recent eras under the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we've seen in more recent years a lot of things that might have attracted us some years ago are being also crushed and destroyed and removed, I guess, from trying to be removed from what China is today. So now the party is working very hard, actually, to lay claim to or to try and associate itself with those attractive things that we could talk about in relation to China. So the Confucius Institutes, for example, you know, there's a lot of accusations out there, and I'm sure in some cases they're true, that Confucius Institutes are actually channels or vehicles for party propaganda, and I think probably at the end of the day they are. But they're also attempting to convey these, you know, historically attractive things about China, like language and culture. So the party understands that there are some attractive things about China that people like. The problem for the party is that they are trying to take ownership of them. They are trying to, I would say, appropriate, take them onto the party, which ruins it. It ruins it, in my mind, and destroys the possibility then that those parts of China can be attractive still to a broader international audience. So to your question, what should the party do? Well, it's a conundrum. It's a real problem, because I think, certainly for me, but I think I'm speaking for billions of people on the planet. It has to open up. It has to be more reform-minded. It has to be a more just and attractive place, a place that people want to follow, a place that people want to be a part of, a set of ideas and ideals that we're willing to say, yes, I want that too. And I just don't think what the party represents can do that. They can't yet, and I don't think ever. So the short answer to your question is they won't be able to develop a true soft power. But they will develop a way of using hard power softly, or even harshly, to get what they want.
Well, thank you very much. On that optimistic note, we are going to finish today, and we're delighted to have you, Bates. And
thank you, Sasha.
We hope very much that you can come in person. Well, when we have freedom of when we get back our freedom of movement.
It'd be my pleasure. And thank you
very much, and I hope you can go and have a sleep.
Thank you, Sasha.
Right.
And thanks, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.